Richard Wallace sat alone in his Manhattan penthouse, the skyline of New York glowing through the glass walls like a constellation of fireflies trapped in steel. His phone vibrated on the marble counter. At first, he ignored it, sipping his bourbon, trying to drown the silence that had become his most loyal companion. But the ringing returned, insistent, demanding. With a sigh, he picked it up. "Mr. Wallace?" The voice on the other end trembled but carried a sharp urgency. It was the voice of a girl, young but unyielding. "Yes, who is this?" "My name's Jasmine Carter. You don't know me, but you need to listen. Your son, Ethan, he's trapped inside a shed. It's on fire. He can't get out." The words sliced through him. Richard froze, his chest tightening. His grip on the glass loosened until it slipped, shattering across the polished floor. "What did you just say?" His voice cracked in disbelief. "I saw him run inside, the door shut, and now the fire's spreading. No one else noticed. Please, you have to do something. Call someone. He's in danger." Her words rushed out like floodwater. Richard's mind raced, trying to stitch together reason, but none of it made sense. Ethan was supposed to be safe in Atlanta, under the watch of staff who were paid precisely to prevent something like this. Yet here was a stranger, a girl whose voice trembled but never broke, telling him that his son's life hung in the balance. For a heartbeat he wanted to dismiss her, to assume it was some cruel prank targeting a man with more money than time. But something in her tone clawed past his defenses, the kind of conviction that couldn't be faked. He slammed the phone against his ear. "Where are you calling from? How do you even know my son?" "I live near your estate. My grandma and I walk by there every evening." "I saw Ethan go into the shed before the flames started. I yelled, but he didn't hear me. The fire's getting worse. If you don't believe me, that's on you, but he needs help right now." Richard's pulse hammered. The thought of Ethan, 8 years old, shy, with eyes that mirrored his late grandfather's quiet stubbornness, flashed in his mind. Panic carved its way through his carefully constructed composure. He staggered back, his chest heavy, his thoughts a blur. "Stay there," he said, his voice dropping to a growl meant as much for himself as for her. "Don't leave him." "I'm not going anywhere," Jasmine shot back. "But you better act fast." The line went dead, leaving only the faint hum of city life beneath him. Richard stood still, surrounded by fragments of broken glass, the silence now deafening. This was no prank. He knew it. Something about the girl's certainty gnawed at him, forcing him to confront a truth he had spent years avoiding. For all his power, all his billions, he was helpless when it came to the people who mattered most. And if Jasmine was right, if his son truly was trapped inside a burning shed hundreds of miles away, then every second wasted here was another nail sealing Ethan's fate. Before we continue this story of desperation, courage, and redemption, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Every story we share brings you closer to unforgettable journeys like this one. Don't miss what comes next. Richard dropped the ruined glass into the trash and snatched his phone again, his fingers fumbling over the contacts. He barked orders at his staff, demanded answers from Atlanta authorities, but every response he received only thickened the fog of dread. Reports trickled in of fire engines racing toward his estate. No confirmation yet, no assurance of Ethan's safety. In that suffocating moment, Richard Wallace, a man who had conquered markets, industries, and empires, discovered the one battlefield where his wealth offered no armor, the fragile thread between father and son. The night stretched long before him, heavy with the weight of decisions and the shadow of consequences. And though he could not know it yet, Jasmine Carter, the girl who dared to call a billionaire, had already altered the course of his life forever. The night air in Atlanta carried the thick scent of smoke, and Jasmine Carter's lungs burned with every breath as she clutched her phone tightly, willing the billionaire on the other end to understand the urgency. When the call ended, she stood frozen at the edge of the Wallace estate, her eyes locked on the flickering glow beyond the trimmed hedges. The shed groaned against the fire, wooden planks snapping like bones, sparks floating upward into the velvet dark. Her hands trembled, but not from fear alone. She knew what it felt like to be dismissed, to have her words brushed aside because of who she was. 16, black, from a neighborhood where voices rarely carried past the chain-link fences. Yet, she hadn't hesitated. Ethan's muffled cry from inside the shed had pierced her heart, and hesitation would have meant silence. She chose to act even if no one believed her. "Lord, watch over that boy," she whispered under her breath. Jasmine lived 2 blocks down in a modest brick house, the kind with chipped paint and a porch that creaked under footsteps. Her grandmother, Loretta Carter, had raised her since she was 6. Life had been a test of endurance, stretching food stamps, working odd jobs, staying safe in a city that could turn harsh at a moment's notice. Jasmine had learned early that no one was going to hand her safety or respect. She had to claim it, inch by inch. That grit pulsed through her now. The neighbors clustered behind her, murmuring, watching the distant flames rise, but none moved closer. Their fear was natural, but Jasmine couldn't understand the stillness. A boy was trapped inside, and she refused to be a bystander. "You called the cops, right?" one man asked, tugging at her sleeve. "I called his father," Jasmine answered firmly. "The fire trucks are on their way, but I'm not leaving him. Not till I know he's out." The man shook his head, muttering something about foolish kids, but Jasmine didn't care. She had always been the one to stand up when others backed down. That stubbornness had earned her detentions at school and long lectures from her grandmother. Yet tonight it was the only thing holding her steady. Memories surfaced uninvited. Her father, gone since she was 2, and her mother, drifting in and out of her life until finally disappearing altogether. Abandonment had carved deep lines inside her, but it had also made her fiercely protective of anyone in danger of being left behind. Ethan Wallace might be a rich man's son, living a life she could barely imagine, but in that fire, he was just a scared child, no different from the kids she looked after in her own neighborhood. She pressed her palms together to still the trembling. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was stepping forward despite it. Jasmine knew that. She had lived it every day in small ways, from standing up to bullies in the hallway to shielding her younger cousins from trouble when the streets grew restless. Tonight was just another test, bigger, hotter, and far more dangerous. A sudden crack split the air and Jasmine flinched. The shed's roof sagged, embers raining down. Panic clawed at her throat. What if the fire crews didn't make it in time? What if Ethan's faint cries faded into silence before help arrived? She bit her lip hard, forcing the tears back. Crying wouldn't save him. Resolve would. She pulled out her phone again, considering dialing Richard Wallace back, but stopped. He had heard her. The weight of the moment was now on his shoulders, and soon the firefighters would charge through the gates. She just had to hold her ground until they came. "Stay strong, Ethan," she whispered, her voice steady now. "I'm not letting you be forgotten." Behind her, voices murmured louder, the orange glow spreading across the night sky, signaling danger that could no longer be ignored. Jasmine squared her shoulders, a lone figure refusing to yield. And though she could not yet see the path ahead, she knew one truth. The choice she made tonight would not only shape Ethan's fate, but would ripple far beyond this burning shed. The shattered glass still glistened across the floor when Richard Wallace dropped heavily into a leather chair, his mind spinning. The city stretched out beyond the tall windows, indifferent, a river of lights flowing endlessly while his own world tilted toward chaos. He pressed his palms against his temples, trying to force logic into the fog, but Jasmine Carter's trembling voice echoed over and over, "Your son is trapped inside a shed. It's on fire." He wanted to believe it wasn't real, that this was some twisted attempt to rattle him, a scam targeting his wealth and reputation. Yet, beneath the fear, a deeper instinct screamed otherwise. Ethan's face appeared before him, his boy's hesitant smile, the way he clutched his sketchbook as though it were a shield. Richard hadn't been there enough to know all the details of his son's life, but he knew his spirit, and Jasmine's conviction had cracked open the walls of denial he hid behind. He jabbed the intercom button on his desk. "Maria, get Atlanta on the line. Now." The assistant's calm professionalism faltered. "Yes, sir." Right away, seconds stretched like hours until a clipped voice finally came through. This is Officer Daniels with the Atlanta Fire Department. This is Richard Wallace, my son, Ethan Wallace. He's on my estate. I received a call saying he's trapped inside a shed that's on fire. Tell me you've got units on site." A pause, then the officer replied, "We have trucks en route, sir. Initial reports confirm a structure fire near your property line. We can't release more until the teams arrive." Richard's chest tightened. That wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. "Listen to me," he snapped, his voice trembling with a desperation he hated. "That's my son. You move every unit you have if you must. Do you hear me?" "Yes, sir." "We're doing everything possible." The line cut, leaving Richard in a silence that roared louder than the city below. He stood abruptly, the room spinning, his carefully built empire suddenly meaningless in the face of a single child's cry for help. He had spent years polishing his image as the untouchable billionaire, the man who turned failing companies into gold, who made decisions with ice in his veins. But now the image cracked, revealing something raw, something human, something terrified. His mind clawed for explanations. How had Ethan been left unsupervised? Why hadn't security noticed? He paid his staff more than most families earned in a year, yet they had failed at the one task that mattered most, protecting his son. Guilt seeped into his veins, thick and bitter. He had chosen to build empires instead of being present, to fly between boardrooms instead of ball games, to pour his energy into legacy rather than love. And now the price for that neglect might be Ethan's life. The intercom buzzed again. "Mr. Wallace, I've arranged clearance for your jet. You can be in Atlanta within hours." Richard grabbed his coat, his movements sharp, almost frantic. "Have the car waiting downstairs. And Maria, cancel everything. Everything." "Yes, sir." He ended the call, but the weight of Jasmine's voice lingered. Why had it taken a stranger to alert him to danger in his own household? And why did her words feel like truth carved in stone? As he strode through the polished corridors of his building, heads turned. Employees sensed something had shattered in their unshakable leader. Richard ignored them. Every step carried him closer to a reality he wasn't prepared to face, that wealth, connections, and power meant nothing against fire and time. He tightened his jaw, whispering to himself as though clinging to a lifeline. "Hold on, Ethan. Just hold on." The city lights blurred past as his car sped toward the private terminal. Outside, the night seemed colder, sharper, as if the world itself conspired to remind him of his fragility. And though the jet engines soon roared to life, drowning out thought, one truth pressed heavy on him. By the time he reached Atlanta, the course of his life might already be forever changed. The jet touched down in Atlanta just before dawn, the horizon painted in muted streaks of gray and orange. Richard stepped onto the tarmac, the humid southern air wrapping around him like a shroud. His chest felt heavy, as though the flight had carried not just miles but the crushing weight of uncertainty. He moved quickly, his security detail trailing behind, though none of them could shield him from the dread clawing at his gut. The car ride from the airport blurred into fragments, neon signs flickering along the freeway, clusters of modest homes giving way to sprawling estates. Atlanta pulsed with a rhythm unlike New York's, slower in some ways, but alive, resilient. Richard barely registered it. His thoughts stayed locked on the estate ahead, on the smoke he imagined still curling upward into the sky, on the boy whose silence over the phone had nearly broken him. When the gates of his property came into view, his heart lurched. Red and blue lights strobed across the manicured lawns, fire engines and police cruisers crowding the driveway. Smoke lingered in the air, acrid and bitter, clinging to everything. Neighbors stood gathered outside the iron gates, their whispers blending into a low hum. Phones flashed, recording, capturing his arrival like it was another headline in the making. As the car halted, Richard pushed the door open before the driver could react. Gravel crunched under his polished shoes as he strode forward, his eyes scanning desperately. The shed at the far end of the property was a charred skeleton, blackened timbers jutting upward like broken ribs. Firefighters moved around it, their reflective gear catching the flashing lights. The sight hollowed him out. "Mr. Wallace?" A uniformed officer stepped into his path, lifting a hand. "We need to keep this area clear. My son..." Richard's voice cracked, rage and fear colliding. "Where is my son?" The officer hesitated, then pointed toward a cluster of paramedics near the main house. "They pulled a boy out. He's stable, but he inhaled a lot of smoke." Relief hit Richard like a tidal wave, buckling his knees for an instant. He pushed past the officer, every muscle burning with the need to see Ethan, to touch him, to confirm he was alive. But before he reached the paramedics, his gaze snagged on a slim figure standing near the fence line. Jasmine. She looked impossibly small against the backdrop of chaos, her worn sneakers coated in dust, her hands smudged with soot. A policewoman was questioning her, scribbling into a notepad while Jasmine gestured toward the wreckage, her voice fierce despite the tremor in it. Richard slowed, torn between rushing to Ethan and confronting the girl whose voice had dragged him across states. Their eyes met briefly. Hers were steady, dark pools of determination that belied her age. She didn't look away. In that instant, Richard recognized the raw courage that had forced her to pick up the phone when no one else did. But others weren't so quick to respect her. A firefighter nearby muttered something about kids making trouble, and the officer interviewing her sighed audibly, clearly doubting her account. Jasmine squared her shoulders, refusing to back down. "I told you," she said firmly, her voice carrying. "I saw him go in before the fire started. If I hadn't called, he wouldn't be here right now. That's the truth." The policewoman raised a brow, skeptical. "And you expect us to believe you just happened to be walking by?" Jasmine's jaw tightened. "Believe what you want." "But I wasn't about to stand there and watch a child die." Richard's throat constricted. For years he had dismissed people, judged them by appearances, by what they could offer him. Now, seeing Jasmine, a teenager in thrift store clothes, outmatched and overlooked, standing firm while professionals doubted her, something inside him shifted. Yet the media's vultures had already begun circling, cameras clicking, whispers swelling into questions about his absence, about his staff's failure. A billionaire's scandal was worth far more than a child's near tragedy. Richard forced himself forward, toward Ethan, but he carried Jasmine's voice with him. Whether he wanted to or not, he knew this girl would not vanish into the shadows of the night. She had already carved her presence into the heart of his unraveling world. Richard's steps faltered as he reached the cluster of paramedics. They surrounded a small figure lying on a stretcher, oxygen mask pressed against his face. Ethan's skin was pale, his eyelids fluttering, chest rising in shallow, uneven breaths. The boy's once neat brown hair was matted with sweat, ash streaked across his cheeks like war paint. "Ethan," Richard whispered, his voice breaking. He dropped to his knees beside the stretcher, brushing trembling fingers over his son's soot-stained hand. For a terrifying moment, Ethan didn't respond. Then, with a faint shiver, his small fingers curled weakly around Richard's. "Dad." The word rasped out, barely audible through the mask, but it shattered Richard completely. Tears he had buried for years threatened to spill, and he didn't care who saw. For once, he wasn't the untouchable billionaire. He was just a father clinging to the fragile life of his child. One paramedic adjusted the oxygen valve and spoke briskly. "He's lucky. Smoke inhalation, minor burns on his arms, but he's alive because someone called fast." Richard's head snapped up. His gaze traveled across the chaos until it landed again on Jasmine, still standing tall despite the skeptical eyes around her. She was the reason Ethan was breathing. A stranger had done what his wealth and power could not. The lead firefighter approached, helmet tucked under his arm, face grimy from smoke. "Mr. Wallace, the fire's contained. The structure's gone. Honestly, your boy's lucky to be out at all. By the time we breached the door, flames were seconds from cutting off escape." Richard swallowed hard, his throat tight. How did this happen?" "Wasn't anyone watching him?" The firefighter hesitated. "That's something your staff will have to answer. All I know is, kids are fast and fire's faster." The words cut deeper than intended. Staff. Responsibility. He had placed his son's safety in the hands of others, while he remained hundreds of miles away and nearly lost him because of it. No amount of money could erase the image of Ethan trapped behind those flames. He turned back to his son, brushing his forehead gently. "I'm here now, Ethan. You're safe." But inside, Richard knew safety was a fragile illusion. Behind him, the hum of reporters swelled louder, questions sharp as arrows. "Mr. Wallace, how could this happen on your property? Where were you when your son was trapped? Is it true a local girl made the emergency call?" The barrage felt endless, a storm he couldn't silence. Yet amid the chaos, Jasmine's voice rose again, firm and steady. "I told you, he went in before the fire started. I called because no one else noticed." That's all. Her words carried no arrogance, only truth. The firefighter gave her a curt nod, the first real acknowledgement she had received all night. But Richard saw more. He saw the courage it had taken to stand her ground against authority figures twice her size, to risk ridicule for insisting on what she knew was right. He turned back to the paramedics as they prepared to lift Ethan onto a gurney. "I'm coming with him," Richard said, his tone brooking no argument. "Of course," one replied. "We'll transport him to Atlanta Children's. He'll need monitoring for at least 24 hours. As they wheeled Ethan toward the ambulance, Richard followed close, his hand never leaving his son's. His mind was a storm of guilt, relief, and dawning realization. He had nearly lost the only person who truly mattered, and it wasn't his wealth or influence that saved Ethan. It was a girl with nothing but conviction in her voice. Richard climbed into the ambulance, the doors slamming shut behind him. The sirens wailed, cutting through the night as they sped toward the hospital. But even as he held Ethan's fragile hand, Richard knew the fire had left scars deeper than the ones on his son's skin. Scars that would not heal quickly. The fluorescent lights of Atlanta Children's Hospital buzzed faintly above, casting a sterile glow across white walls and polished floors. Richard sat hunched in a plastic chair outside the emergency unit, his tailored suit rumpled, his hands locked together as if prayer alone could anchor him. He had spent the entire ambulance ride clutching Ethan's hand, whispering promises the boy was too weak to hear. Now, with his son behind swinging doors and strangers in scrubs working to stabilize him, Richard was left with nothing but silence and dread. Every sound in the corridor seemed amplified, the squeak of sneakers, the rustle of paperwork, the beep of distant monitors. He closed his eyes, but images of the charred shed returned instantly, mingling with Ethan's faint rasp of "Dad." Guilt gnawed at him relentlessly. A doctor finally appeared, removing his gloves. "Mr. Wallace?" Richard jumped to his feet. "Yes. My son. How is he?" The doctor's expression softened. "He's stable. Mild smoke inhalation, a few minor burns, but no lasting damage expected. We'll keep him overnight for observation. You got him here in time." Relief washed over Richard, so sharp it nearly buckled him. "Can I see him?" "In a few minutes. He's resting now." Richard nodded, exhaling shakily, but the tightness in his chest refused to ease. He had been given a second chance, and second chances carried weight. A voice cut through the hallway. "Mr. Wallace." He turned to see Jasmine approaching, accompanied by a nurse who seemed uncertain whether the girl should even be allowed here. Jasmine's clothes were still streaked with soot, her braids pulled back messily, but her eyes held the same fierce steadiness. Richard stared at her, torn between gratitude and suspicion. "You shouldn't be here," he said, though the edge in his voice came more from exhaustion than anger. "I needed to know he's okay," Jasmine replied simply. "I wasn't trying to cause trouble. I just couldn't walk away." The nurse shifted uneasily. "Sir, social services will want to speak with her. She's a minor who inserted herself into a dangerous situation." Richard bristled. Inserted herself? Without Jasmine, Ethan might be ashes and memory. But the skepticism wasn't surprising. He had seen enough boardrooms to recognize when someone's voice was being dismissed. Jasmine crossed her arms. "You think I did this for attention? My grandma always says if you see someone in danger, you act. That's all I did." Richard studied her, the steel in her words clashing against her youth. She was just a girl, yet she had shown more courage than most adults he knew. Still, trust came hard to him, especially now, when the world seemed determined to find cracks in his life. "Why my son?" he asked quietly. "Why did you care?" Jasmine blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Because he's a kid. And kids deserve someone to care no matter who they are." Her answer struck deeper than Richard expected. It was too simple, too honest to ignore. Before he could respond, two men in plain suits approached, social workers, their ID badges swinging. One addressed Jasmine briskly. "Miss Carter, we need to ask you some questions about tonight. Standard procedure." Jasmine stiffened, her jaw set. "I already told the police everything." Richard stepped forward, instinct overriding hesitation. "She stays here until I say otherwise." The men exchanged wary glances. One murmured, "We're just doing our job, Mr. Wallace." Richard's voice hardened. "And I'm doing mine as a father. She saved my son. Show her respect." For the first time since the night began, Jasmine's shoulders eased slightly. She gave Richard a small, almost reluctant nod of acknowledgement. Moments later, a nurse appeared at the doorway. "Mr. Wallace, you can see your son now." Richard moved, but as he did, his eyes lingered on Jasmine. She had been underestimated, doubted, nearly silenced. Yet she had been right all along. And though Ethan was resting safely now, Richard sensed that this girl's presence in their lives had only just begun. The following morning, the world already knew. Headlines splashed across digital screens and printed papers. "Billionaire's son trapped in fire, saved by teen stranger." Reporters clustered outside Atlanta Children's Hospital, their voices rising with each fresh rumor, microphones thrust toward anyone who entered or left. Richard Wallace's private life, once carefully shielded behind layers of wealth and influence, was now a feeding frenzy. Inside, the hospital tried to preserve quiet, but the tension seeped in like smoke under a door. Richard sat by Ethan's bed, watching the slow rhythm of his son's breathing. The oxygen mask had been removed, replaced with a simple nasal cannula, and Ethan's chest rose with steadier strength. Relief should have soothed Richard, yet unease gnawed at him. He knew the storm outside wasn't going to fade quickly. The door opened, and his assistant Maria slipped in, her face pale. "It's everywhere, sir. Networks, blogs, even international outlets. Shareholders are calling non-stop. They want a statement." Richard pinched the bridge of his nose. "A statement won't put this back together." "They're questioning your absence," she said carefully. "And why a 16-year-old girl, not your security staff, was the one who saved Ethan." The words stabbed sharper than she knew. Richard glanced at Ethan, guilt twisting like a knife. The truth was unavoidable. He hadn't been there, and it was Jasmine Carter, not the adults on his payroll, who had acted. Before he could reply, a knock sounded. A nurse stepped aside, revealing Jasmine and her grandmother. Mrs. Loretta Carter walked with slow dignity, her grey hair tied neatly, her Sunday dress plain but pressed. Jasmine hovered just behind, uncertain but determined. Richard rose, straightening instinctively. "Mrs. Carter," he said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, her gaze unwavering. "Mr. Wallace, I came because my granddaughter deserves to be treated with respect, not suspicion. She did what any decent soul should have done, and instead she's being questioned as if she caused the fire herself." Jasmine looked at the floor but added softly, "I just wanted to make sure Ethan's okay." Richard glanced at his son, then back at the girl. "He's alive because of you." The admission cost him pride but not honesty, and I won't forget that. Loretta's eyes softened slightly, though her voice remained firm. "Good, because people like us don't usually get remembered by men like you. We get brushed aside once the cameras leave." The bluntness struck Richard harder than any reporter's question. He had built a life on efficiency, profit, image, but here was a grandmother reminding him of a truth money couldn't polish away. A sudden commotion erupted in the hallway. Reporters had slipped past security, voices echoing. "Mr. Wallace, did neglect put your son in danger? Jasmine, how does it feel to save a billionaire's child? Are you planning to sue for damages, sir?" Nurses hurried to push them back, but not before flashes lit the room, cameras snapping at Ethan's fragile form. Richard's chest burned with fury. He shielded his son instinctively, glaring at the intruders. "Enough!" His voice cracked like thunder. "This is a hospital, not a circus. Get out!" Security rushed in, forcing the reporters back. The door slammed shut, leaving silence thick as fog. Richard's pulse hammered, but when he turned, Jasmine's wide eyes were fixed on him, not with fear, but with something like understanding. Mrs. Carter placed a steady hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. "Don't let them twist this, Jasmine. You did right." "That's what matters." Richard sank back into his chair, running a hand over his face. For the first time, he realized this wasn't just about Ethan's survival. The fire had lit another blaze, one that threatened his reputation, his company, and the fragile bond with his son. And in the middle of it all stood Jasmine Carter, unwilling to fade quietly into the background. 2 days later, the hospital discharged Ethan, sending him home with strict instructions for rest and follow-up therapy. Richard rode beside him in the black SUV, the boy leaning silently against the seat. Ethan hadn't spoken more than a few words since the fire. He stared out the tinted window as Atlanta blurred past. Strip malls, fast food signs, leafy neighborhoods. His silence pressing harder on Richard than any accusation from the press. Back at the Wallace estate, security stood taller than usual, staff moving with rehearsed precision, but the tension was unmistakable. Whispers carried through the halls, blame, embarrassment, fear. Richard ignored them all, guiding Ethan upstairs to his room. The boy clung to his sketchbook like a lifeline, refusing to meet his father's eyes. Richard lingered at the doorway, helpless. "You're safe now," he offered softly. Ethan didn't answer. He closed his book and turned toward the window, the faint reflection of flames flickering across the glass only in Richard's mind. Later that afternoon, Jasmine and her grandmother arrived at the estate. Richard had invited them, not out of courtesy, but necessity. He couldn't ignore the girl who had risked everything, nor the press that still hounded her. When the butler opened the door, Jasmine stepped inside, her sneakers squeaking against polished marble. Her gaze flicked upward at the chandeliers, the grand staircase, the walls lined with oil paintings of men who looked nothing like her. She shoved her hands into the pockets of her hoodie, suddenly aware of every detail of her thrift store clothes. Mrs. Carter walked steadily beside her granddaughter, unshaken. She glanced around, unimpressed. "A house can be mighty big," she murmured to Jasmine, "and still feel empty." Richard greeted them in the sitting room. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice stiff. Gratitude didn't come easily to him. "I wanted Ethan to see you. He hasn't spoken much since the fire." Jasmine hesitated. "If he doesn't want me here, I can go." But Richard shook his head. "Stay." Ethan entered quietly, shoulders hunched. His eyes darted toward Jasmine, then down to the carpet. For a moment no one spoke. Then Jasmine knelt slightly, lowering herself to his level. "Hey, Ethan," she said gently. "I'm glad you're okay." The boy's lips trembled, his voice barely a whisper. "It was dark. I couldn't breathe." Jasmine's chest tightened, but she didn't flinch. "That must have been scary, but you were brave and you're not alone anymore." Ethan glanced at his father briefly before murmuring, "Everyone was yelling. Nobody heard me." Richard's stomach twisted at the quiet accusation. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Jasmine, however, reached out slowly, her palm open. "I heard you," she said simply. Ethan stared at her hand for a long moment, before placing his small fingers in hers. It wasn't much, but for Richard, it was more than he had managed since the fire. Later, as Mrs. Carter sipped tea in the parlor, she fixed Richard with a steady gaze. "You've built a fortress, Mr. Wallace, but a child doesn't need walls, he needs presence." Richard bristled, but her words struck true. "I provide for him," he said defensively. "Providing isn't the same as being there," she replied. The silence that followed was heavier than any boardroom negotiation Richard had ever faced. That evening, after the Carters left, Richard paced his study. Their visit had left a crack in his armor. His wealth, his status, none of it had bridged the gulf between him and his son. Yet Jasmine, with nothing but sincerity, had managed to reach Ethan in minutes. Richard sank into his chair, staring at the glow of the city through the window. For the first time, he wondered if the very life he had built was the reason his son had nearly been lost. The fire marshal's report arrived 3 days later, and Richard read it alone in his study, the morning sun struggling through the tall windows. The words blurred as his jaw tightened, evidence of accelerant present, possible ignition source inconsistent with electrical failure. In plain terms, it hadn't been an accident. He slammed the folder shut, the echo rattling the crystal decanter on his desk. Someone had set the fire. Someone had nearly killed his son. Maria entered quietly, her expression tense. The press is already speculating. If this goes public, they'll say your negligence invited it. Richard glared. Negligence? Someone tried to burn my boy alive. This isn't about headlines, it's about enemies. Then you'll need proof, she countered gently. Proof. The word dug deep. He had built his empire on evidence, numbers, and strategy. But now, the only real witness was a 16-year-old girl whom no one seemed eager to believe. Later that afternoon, Detective Harris arrived at the estate. A veteran with graying hair and a skeptical stare, he didn't bother hiding his doubts. Mr. Wallace, we're treating this as suspicious, but arson's hard to prove. Do you have anyone who'd want to hurt you? Richard gave a bitter laugh. Make a list. Competitors, ex-partners, politicians, I refuse to bankroll. Take your pick. Harris scribbled a note. We'll need to interview your staff again. And that girl, the one who made the call. Jasmine. She returned to the estate that evening with her grandmother, answering the detective's questions patiently. Richard stood nearby, listening as she described the shadowy figure she'd glimpsed near the shed before the flames erupted. It wasn't just smoke, Jasmine insisted. I saw someone run off, tall, wearing a dark hoodie. They moved fast like they didn't want to be seen. Harris tapped his pen, unconvinced. It was dark, are you sure? Jasmine's eyes narrowed. I know what I saw. Her conviction stirred something in Richard, but Harris only sighed. Eyewitness testimony's shaky, especially from a kid. Jasmine bristled. I'm not lying. Believe me or don't, but Ethan could have died if I hadn't called. The detective closed his notebook, non-committal. We'll look into it. When he left, Jasmine muttered under her breath, They never listen until it's too late. Richard heard her. For years, he had dismissed voices he didn't deem credible, employees, critics, even Ethan's mother. But Jasmine's refusal to back down rang with truth. She wasn't angling for attention, she was demanding to be heard. Mrs. Carter placed a hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. Don't waste breath proving yourself to those who don't want to see. You know your truth. That night, Richard walked the grounds alone, the charred remains of the shed a black scar at the edge of his property. The acrid smell still lingered, clinging to the earth. He imagined Ethan's small body inside those flames, imagined what silence he might have returned to if Jasmine hadn't acted. Rage curled in his gut, sharp and unfamiliar. For the first time in years, Richard felt powerless in a battle he couldn't buy or strategize his way through. He wasn't fighting markets or mergers, he was fighting shadows, faceless enemies who had threatened his child. When he returned to the house, Ethan was awake, sitting cross-legged on his bed with his sketchbook open. The boy glanced up hesitantly. Dad, the fire wasn't an accident, was it? Richard froze, then crossed the room and sat beside him. No, it wasn't. Ethan's small hands tightened around the pencil. Then they might come back. Richard's throat constricted. He rested a hand on his son's shoulder. Not while I'm here, I promise you, Ethan, I won't let them touch you again. Yet as the boy leaned against him for the first time in months, Richard knew the promise was heavier than any he had made in his boardroom career. This wasn't about profit or legacy, this was war, and his family was the battlefield. The morning after the detective's visit, Richard sat alone in the dining room, untouched coffee cooling beside him. The house was quiet, too quiet for comfort. Every creak in the halls reminded him that silence had once been his preference, but now it felt suffocating. Ethan's words from the night before echoed mercilessly. They might come back. Maria entered holding her tablet. Sir, there's someone you should speak with. She's here. Richard looked up sharply. Who? Maria hesitated. Clara. The name hit like a fist to his chest. Clara Bennett, Ethan's mother. Their relationship had ended years ago in a storm of accusations, distance, and bitter silence. He had buried her presence behind settlements and court orders, but now she stood at the gates demanding to see her son. Richard's jaw tightened. I don't want her in this house. Maria's voice softened. She's his mother. And the press is already circling her. If you shut her out, they'll spin it against you. Moments later, Clara entered. She hadn't changed much, still carrying herself with a quiet strength, though time had etched new lines around her eyes. Her gaze swept the room before fixing on Richard. "Where is he?" she demanded. "Asleep," Richard replied curtly. "He needs rest." Clara's eyes narrowed. "He needed more than rest long before this fire. Don't pretend you've been the father he deserves." The accusation cut deep, though he refused to flinch. "And you? You left. You chose distance." "I chose survival," she shot back. "You drowned yourself in work and money, and there was no room left for me." "But Ethan, he was supposed to matter to you." Richard's fists clenched on the table, but before the old bitterness consumed him, another voice interrupted. "You two are wasting breath." Both turned to see Jasmine leaning in the doorway, arms crossed. Her tone carried none of the hesitation she had shown before. "Ethan doesn't need your war," she said firmly. "He needs peace. He needs parents who see him, not just each other's failures." The silence that followed was heavy, but Jasmine didn't back down. She stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Richard. "You asked me why I cared. This is why. Because kids suffer when grown-ups care more about being right than being present." Clara blinked, surprised by the girl's boldness. Richard, though stung, found himself unable to argue. Her words sliced clean through the years of resentment, exposing a truth he had refused to face. Mrs. Carter, who had accompanied her granddaughter, entered quietly behind. She rested a hand on Jasmine's shoulder and addressed Richard and Clara. "This girl is young, but she's not wrong. I raised her to believe action means more than excuses. Maybe you two could learn something from her." Richard felt the ground shift beneath him. For so long he had equated strength with control, but now he saw strength in a teenager's defiance, in a grandmother's wisdom, even in Clara's refusal to back down. And for the first time he questioned whether his pride had cost Ethan more than he realized. Clara's voice softened as she turned back to Richard. "We don't have to like each other. But we owe Ethan more than this. He deserves two parents willing to put him first." Richard exhaled slowly, the fight draining out of him. "You're right," he admitted quietly, the words tasting foreign but true. "He deserves better." As the weight of the moment settled, Ethan's footsteps padded softly into the room. He clutched his sketchbook, blinking sleepily at the tense gathering. "What's going on?" he asked. Richard forced a smile, his voice steady but fragile. "Just figuring things out, son." Ethan tilted his head, studying his father, his mother, and Jasmine standing between them. For the first time, Richard didn't look away. He understood that the past couldn't be erased, but perhaps with humility it could be faced. Detective Harris returned 2 days later, his expression grimmer than before. He spread photographs across Richard's mahogany desk, grainy surveillance stills, scorched fragments pulled from the shed, chemical residue reports. The evidence was damning. "Accelerants confirmed," Harris said flatly. "This was deliberate. Whoever did this wanted the fire to spread fast. We're tracing supply purchases, but so far, no suspects we can pin it on." Richard's jaw tightened as he studied the photos. In one, a faint silhouette in a dark hoodie blurred at the edge of the frame. It matched Jasmine's account almost exactly. "She told you the truth," Richard said quietly. Harris gave a reluctant nod. "Looks like it, but testimony from a 16-year-old won't hold much weight in court unless we back it up with hard evidence." Jasmine, who had insisted on being present, leaned forward. "So you believe me now?" The detective sighed. "Let's just say your story lines up better than I expected." Jasmine crossed her arms, her chin lifting defiantly. "I don't care if a judge believes me. I care that Ethan's safe." Richard glanced at her, struck once again by how naturally she cut through pretense. She wasn't chasing validation, she was chasing justice. But the relief of validation didn't last. Harris's next words landed like a hammer. "We found something else. The accelerant used, it's the same type linked to recent acts of sabotage in Atlanta. Targets mostly connected to high-profile development projects. That includes some of your ventures, Mr. Wallace." Richard's chest tightened. He had faced competition before, but this was different. This was personal. "You're telling me someone came after my son to send me a message?" "That's one possibility," Harris admitted. "Until we have proof, I can't confirm." Later that evening, Richard stood on the terrace, the humid air thick with the scent of wet earth after a brief rain. Jasmine joined him quietly, hands tucked into her hoodie pocket. "Whoever did this," she said, "they're not done." "People like that don't stop until they get what they want." Richard turned to her sharply. "And what do you know about people like that?" Her gaze didn't waver. "Enough. I've seen what happens when people in my neighborhood cross the wrong folks. My grandma's had to pull me inside more than once when fights broke out. I know the look of danger. And I saw it that night." Her words carried a weight beyond her years, and Richard found himself listening more carefully than he had intended. Inside, Mrs. Carter was speaking with Clara in the living room. Her voice carried, firm and steady. "You need to think about that boy first. This house may be big, but it won't keep out trouble. You two better figure out how to fight together, not apart." Clara rubbed her temples. "Easier said than done. Richard doesn't listen." "He's listening now," Mrs. Carter replied. "Fear has a way of humbling even the proud." Richard heard it as he stepped back inside, but said nothing. He couldn't deny the truth. Fear was reshaping him, forcing him to see allies in places he'd never looked. That night, as he tucked Ethan into bed, the boy clutched his sketchbook tightly. "Dad," Ethan whispered, "if they come back, what if I'm not lucky again?" The words twisted like a knife. Richard sat on the edge of the bed, his hand resting firmly over his son's. "I won't let them touch you again, you hear me? Not you, not Jasmine, not anyone close to us." Ethan's eyes flicked up at him. "You promise?" Richard swallowed hard. "I promise." Yet even as he said it, a chill settled over him. Promises were easy. Protection was not. And somewhere in the city, someone was already planning their next move. The community center gym buzzed with voices, folding chairs arranged in uneven rows. Richard had agreed, reluctantly, to attend the emergency meeting called by local residents. The fire at his estate had shaken not only his family, but also the surrounding neighborhood. People wanted answers, and they weren't shy about demanding them. When Richard entered with Jasmine and Mrs. Carter at his side, conversations dimmed into murmurs. Some eyes held curiosity, others suspicion, and a few outright resentment. Billionaires didn't often walk into rooms like this, and certainly not to face the people whose lives were far removed from private jets and marble floors. Councilman Rivera stepped to the microphone. "We're here tonight because what happened last week doesn't just concern one family. Fires, sabotage, and violence don't stop at property lines. We need accountability. Mr. Wallace, the floor is yours." Richard cleared his throat, aware of the weight of every gaze. "I came here tonight because I failed," he began, his voice low but steady. "I failed my son, and I failed this community by believing walls and wealth could keep us safe. They couldn't." A man in the back scoffed. "Easy words when you've got security guards at your gate." Murmurs rippled through the room. Richard tightened his grip on the podium. He could feel the hostility. But before he could respond, Jasmine's voice cut through. "That fire didn't care about gates," she said firmly, standing from her seat. "I saw someone running away that night. I called because nobody else did. If it wasn't stopped, it could have spread to the houses nearby. My grandma's house." "Your houses?" The crowd shifted uneasily. A woman near the front asked, "And you expect us to believe you? You're just a kid." Jasmine didn't flinch. "Believe what you want. But I stood there when everyone else watched. That boy's alive because I didn't wait for someone richer or older to do the right thing." Her words rang through the room like a challenge. "Mrs. Carter nodded in approval, her voice carrying from her seat. "My granddaughter's young, but she's lived long enough to know silence doesn't save anyone. Maybe it's time we all remembered that." Richard glanced at Jasmine, gratitude welling in him. She had defended him in a way he hadn't expected, not with polished speeches, but with raw truth. He leaned forward again, meeting the eyes of the crowd. "She's right. This isn't about wealth or status. Whoever set that fire threatened every one of us. They wanted chaos. And if we keep standing apart, they'll get exactly that. For a moment, silence hung heavy. Then Councilman Rivera spoke again. "So what do you propose, Mr. Wallace?" Richard exhaled slowly. "Resources. Protection. I'll fund better lighting, more security for this neighborhood, and scholarships for young people like Jasmine who step up when adults don't. But I can't do it alone. I need your trust. I need us to stand together." A murmur of consideration spread. It wasn't applause, not yet, but it wasn't rejection either. After the meeting ended, as people trickled out with cautious hope, Jasmine approached Richard. "You didn't sound like the man in the newspapers," she said. He managed a faint smile. "Maybe I'm trying not to be." Her eyes studied him for a long moment. "Then keep trying, because people don't change overnight." Mrs. Carter joined them, her voice warm but firm. "Words are a start. But action, that's where you'll prove yourself." Richard nodded, the weight of the evening settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt less like a man defending an empire and more like a man being held accountable, not just by strangers, but by a girl who refused to be silenced. Ethan sat on the porch steps of the estate, the afternoon sun spilling across the lawn. His sketchbook rested on his knees, pages filled with jagged lines, fire, smoke, shadows with no faces. Each drawing was a piece of the fear still lodged inside him. Richard stood in the doorway, watching silently, torn between wanting to comfort his son and not knowing how. Jasmine appeared at the gate, carrying a backpack slung over one shoulder. She hesitated before walking up the driveway, her sneakers crunching against the gravel. Ethan looked up, his guarded expression softening just slightly. "You came," he said quietly. "Of course I came," Jasmine replied, dropping onto the step beside him. "What are you drawing?" Ethan flipped the book shut, embarrassed. "It's nothing." Jasmine tilted her head. "Doesn't look like nothing." "Looks like a lot." For a moment, Ethan didn't respond. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he admitted, "Every time I close my eyes, I see the fire again. I hear it, like it's chasing me." Richard's chest ached at the words. He started forward, but Jasmine spoke first. "I know what that's like," she said. "When my mom left, I kept hearing her voice every night. Like she was still there, but she wasn't. It took me a long time to figure out that it wasn't going to stop on its own. I had to talk about it, draw it, let it out." Ethan's eyes widened. You get scared too?" Jasmine nodded firmly. "All the time. But scared doesn't mean weak. It just means you've got something to fight through." Ethan studied her for a long moment, then slowly opened his sketchbook again. He turned the pages toward her, showing the rough drawings, flames swallowing walls, a boy trapped in black smoke. "They don't look right," he muttered. "They just look messy." "They look real," Jasmine countered, "and that's what matters." "You're telling the truth on paper." Richard finally stepped closer, crouching beside them. His voice was gentle. "She's right, Ethan. Those drawings, they're brave." The boy looked at his father cautiously, as if testing the sincerity in his words. For the first time since the fire, he didn't look away. Over the next week, Jasmine came by every afternoon after school. Sometimes she and Ethan drew together. Sometimes they just talked. Richard watched from a distance, humbled by how quickly the boy opened to her. Where therapy sessions with strangers had met with silence, Jasmine's honesty cracked the walls around Ethan's heart. One evening, as the three of them sat on the porch, Ethan finally spoke about the night of the fire. "I thought you weren't going to come, Dad. I thought you didn't care." The words pierced Richard deeper than any business failure ever had. He swallowed hard. "I was too far away, Ethan, and that's on me. But don't ever think I don't care. You're the most important person in my life. He broke off, shaking his head. "I didn't show it the way I should have." Ethan studied him, his eyes shimmering. "You promise you'll stay this time?" Richard reached for his hand, squeezing gently. "I promise." Jasmine watched quietly, a small smile tugging at her lips. She had seen enough broken promises in her own life to know they were fragile things. But in Richard's voice she heard something different, an edge of desperation that came only from a man who had almost lost everything. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, Ethan leaned against his father for the first time in months. Jasmine sat beside them, silent but steady, a bridge between two worlds, slowly learning how to meet in the middle. The breakthrough came a week later. Detective Harris arrived at the Wallace estate with a folder thick enough to make Richard's stomach tighten. He laid the papers on the desk with deliberate weight, his expression sharper than usual. "We got them," Harris said. "Two men, both with prior records for property damage, paid under the table by someone connected to development disputes. One of them confessed. They were hired to scare you, maybe worse. The fire was no accident." Richard leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "Who hired them?" Harris hesitated, then answered. "A rival developer, a man you've clashed with in court before. Name's already in the press thanks to the leak. He's being arraigned tomorrow." The words hit like a storm. Richard had expected sabotage, but hearing confirmation left him both vindicated and enraged. His empire had survived countless attacks, but this one had nearly stolen his son. "They'll pay for this," Richard said, his voice low, almost a growl. Harris gave a curt nod. "The courts will handle them. But I'll be honest, what made the difference wasn't our surveillance or your staff. It was the girl. Jasmine Carter. Her testimony matched the confession almost word for word. Without her, we'd still be chasing shadows." Richard glanced toward the doorway where Jasmine stood, hands shoved in her pockets. She shifted uncomfortably, unused to praise from men in suits. "You hear that?" Harris said to her. "You held your ground. That's what broke this open." Jasmine shrugged, her voice quiet but firm. "I just told the truth." Later, Richard gathered Ethan, Jasmine, and Mrs. Carter in the living room. His voice carried a weight none of them had heard from him before. The men who set the fire were caught. Justice is moving forward, but the truth is, none of it would have happened without Jasmine. She saved Ethan's life, and she stood tall when no one wanted to believe her. That kind of courage deserves more than words. Ethan looked at Jasmine with wide eyes. "I already told you. You're my hero." Jasmine's cheeks flushed, and she ducked her head. "Heroes don't get scared," she whispered. "Yes, they do," Richard corrected gently. "The difference is they act anyway." Mrs. Carter placed a hand on her granddaughter's back, her eyes glistening with pride. "She's always been that way, stubborn as the day is long but steady when it counts." The next morning, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters. The rival developer was led inside in handcuffs, the story plastered across every network. Richard issued a public statement, not about his wealth nor his rivals, but about gratitude. "My son is alive because a young girl refused to be silent," he told the cameras. "I owe her more than I can ever repay. This isn't just my victory, it's hers." The words rippled through headlines. "Billionaire credits teen hero for son's rescue." For once, the press wasn't painting Richard as untouchable or cold. They painted him as human, flawed, humbled, and indebted to a girl whose courage defied every barrier between their worlds. That evening, back at the estate, Richard found Ethan sketching again, this time drawing not flames, but a figure standing tall with her hands on her hips. "That's Jasmine," Ethan said proudly, "the way I see her." Richard smiled faintly, emotion tightening his chest. "You're right, son. That's exactly who she is." Justice had been served in court, but in Richard's heart it was more than legal victory. It was a reckoning, a reminder that strength wasn't measured by the empires he built, but by the people who dared to stand beside him when the fire burned hottest. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue across the Wallace estate, but this time the grounds weren't silent or guarded. Dozens of people from the community gathered on the lawn, neighbors, local leaders, and families who had once watched the estate from a distance with skepticism. Now folding chairs dotted the grass, children ran between tables of food, and conversations rose in warm waves. Richard had opened his gates for the first time, not for a gala or a business gathering, but for something entirely different, a celebration of survival, unity, and new beginnings. At the center of it all stood Jasmine, tugging nervously at the hem of her dress. She wasn't used to attention, and certainly not this kind. Yet every person who stopped to shake her hand, every smile aimed her way, reminded her that courage had a ripple effect far greater than she ever imagined. Mrs. Carter watched from a chair near the stage, her sharp eyes softened with pride. "You've done good, girl," she murmured when Jasmine passed by. "I didn't do it for all this," Jasmine replied. I couldn't walk away." "That's why it matters," her grandmother said. When the crowd settled, Richard stepped to the small stage, Ethan holding his hand. The boy clutched his sketchbook against his chest, but his eyes shone brighter than they had in weeks. Richard looked over the crowd, the weight of the moment pressing against him. "I spent years believing strength came from walls, money, and control," he began. "But the fire taught me something I can't forget. My son is alive today not because of my resources, but because a young woman refused to stay silent. Jasmine Carter reminded me what true courage looks like." The audience turned toward her, applause rising. Jasmine ducked her head, cheeks burning, but Ethan squeezed her arm proudly. Richard continued, his voice steady. "I've established a scholarship fund in Jasmine's name. It will support young leaders in this community who show the same bravery and integrity she has, because we need more voices like hers, voices that speak when others won't." Applause swelled louder, filling the air with warmth. Jasmine blinked rapidly, caught between disbelief and gratitude. Ethan tugged at her sleeve. "See, I told you you're a hero." She smiled faintly. "Guess you were right." Richard scanned the crowd again, then lowered his voice slightly, more personal now. "I failed my son by being absent, and I nearly lost him. But this community, this family, and this girl gave me a chance to change. I won't waste it." Clara, standing near the back, caught his eye. For the first time in years, her gaze wasn't hardened with anger. She gave a small nod, an acknowledgement that words had turned into action. As the sun dipped lower, laughter and music replaced tension. Neighbors lingered long after the speeches ended, breaking bread together where once only walls had stood. Ethan sat cross-legged on the grass beside Jasmine, showing her his latest drawing. The two of them standing side by side, the flames behind them fading into nothing. "Not bad," Jasmine said, smiling. Richard watched them, a quiet peace settling over him. The fire had taken much, but it had also given him something unexpected, a chance at redemption, a bridge between two worlds that once seemed impossible to connect. As the evening drew to a close, Richard addressed the guests one final time. "Thank you for being part of this new beginning. And if you followed this journey, don't forget, subscribe for more stories that remind us courage can come from the most unexpected places. And before you leave, click on the suggested video on your screen. There's another story waiting for you." The crowd applauded once more, but for Richard, the true applause was quieter, the sound of his son's laughter mingling with Jasmine's, echoing across the lawn like a promise that the worst was behind them and the future was theirs to shape.